Good evening, everyone. My name is Vijika Ramapurthy. I'm a member of I am the Director of Communications at Climate and Community Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight to the past, present, and future of divesting from militarism. I'd like to thank our event partner, Commonwealth, 1125 venues, our hosts, our brilliant panelists, and of course you all for joining us tonight. I'll keep my introduction very short so we can have plenty of time to have this conversation. Climate and Community Institute is a progressive climate and economy think tank with a growing staff of over 60 research members based in universities and organizations across the country and the world. So we help connect the demands of community groups and the desires of those in power for more ambitious and creative climate goals in the near term, and to build out a vision and public imagination for the kind of world just decarbonization can make possible in the long term, both with your progressive political ways. Climate action and secure impactful non-plastic change. And Commonwealth was founded in 2019 based on the insights that ownership is the structuring force in our economy, and that currently uses property power of social margin that we can and must be reimagined. They work at all levels from grassroots groups, national and international policymakers, combining rigorous analysis of research with bold ideas for an economy that works for everyone. These two groups have collaborated to produce a wealth of work on the intersection of militarism and the climate crisis, emphasizing the fact that military force is the foundation of the fossil fuel economy worldwide and is responsible for about 5.5% of global carbon emissions. In fact, from that layer level. Militaries generally comprise the majority of any government's direct emissions, have budgets that dominate spending priorities, wield violence to secure fossil mineral interests and financial assistance, and present a general impact in terms of funding climate adaptation and mitigation efforts in the South, which has of course done the least to contribute to the crisis overall. In our joint report, Less War, Less Warning, we outline policy solutions to reversing these centuries of unjust domination and extraction, including reducing military operations, closing bases, paying reparations for past and present pollution, and more. You can read that report at our websites. As we at the Climate Community Institute write in our statement on climate justice case in our immediate ceasefire in Palestine, there's climate justice everywhere. Internationalism is a clear path to overthrowing the violent political economy in which climate crisis is unfolding, and militarization is the obstacle. So without further ado, so we can dive into the long horizon of this material and political extraction, I want to introduce our moderator, Hannah Homestead. Hannah Homestead is a research analyst with the National Priorities Project of the Institute for Policy Studies. Her work focuses on right-sizing the federal budget to prioritize human and ecological security, including examining the intersections of climate crisis, capitalism, and militarism. Prior to joining MPP, Hannah directed the Climate and Militarism Program at the Center for International Policy, advocated for sex work decriminalization in Wisconsin, and served as a global health board fellow at the Uganda. She earned a master's degree from Columbia School of International Public Affairs and a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you so very much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. Thank you also to Patrick and to Commonwealth for putting this event on and getting us all together. This is a really important issue, and it's just so great to be in the space with everybody to dig in. So we have an incredible lineup of panelists today. I'm just going to go down the line here. We have Ken Romelli from Commonwealth, Bill Hartung from the Finley Institute, Adrian Salazar from the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and then of course Patrick Ficker, who's the research director at Climate and Community Project, who's hosting the event today. So I'm going to just and Miriam Pemberton. I'm joining us on Zoom. We're so excited and fortunate to have. Right. And so we're really looking forward to a really great conversation today. I'm going to start off with just a few words, but then we'll hear from our panelists, and also really hoping to get some good questions from the audience and engagement. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well. Of course, we're here today to talk about the urgent need to divest from militarization and invest in climate justice to address the urgent threat of climate change that we're facing, which we know is the greatest global threat to humanity facing us around the world. This is to do the climate crisis includes global warming, but also includes biodiversity loss and pollution, and that it's pushing us towards ecological tipping points that it preceded will really end like on Earth for the majority of humans.
So we know that climate crisis is already underway. We see the effects in real time with new records being set year after year for extreme heat, fires, and flooding. Of course, the worst effects being felt disproportionately by populations that are least responsible for creating. So while the science has been clear for more than 50 years, our policymakers continue to disproportionately invest in militarism over meaningful investments in climate action, which requires mitigating our impact on the climate, adapting to the changes that are already underway, and also taking accountability for the harm that the climate crisis is causing to the population. So we have some estimates that say a Green New Deal for the United States would require between $600 billion to $1 trillion of public investment over a decade, which is equivalent to roughly 1 year of the Department of Defense budget, which is closing in on $1 trillion. Also, a Commonwealth report that Ken worked on, I believe, showed that climate spending in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of the biggest meaningful investment in climate programs thus far in the United States, only between 1/10 to maybe 1/20th of the amount of government spends on the military. So we see a really disproportionate level of investment there. So yes, more than half of the discretionary budget is currently allocated to the military, which is justified to advance and safeguard vital U.S. interests around the world, which is sort of defend oil. The DoD also spends approximately $80 billion a year protecting global oil supplies, which is about 16 to 20% of the DoD base budget. So this enormous amount of spending is framed as necessary to maintaining U.S. and global security, but we know that it actually exacerbates conditions that lead to violence, which we'll hear more about when we talk about the genocide. I also want to say a quick few things too, that militarism has logical impacts that are typically overlooked. The military itself is a major source of climate emissions, as we know. But in addition to that, toxic contamination and biodiversity loss of our hyper-militarized security strategies has global impacts and is something that we are not necessarily looking at enough from my perspective. Between bombs, burn pits, dumping of chemicals, these have severely horrible impacts on populations abroad, and at home we know there's more than 40,000 contaminated sites across the United States in our territories that are contaminated with toxic waste from weapons testing and production in improper disposal. So this ecological harm has really been enabled by politicians on both sides of the aisle to deprioritize and deregulate environmental protection in order to prioritize increasing militarization at the expense of the rest of the world and working people. And so, in addition, though, to accelerating the climate collapse and crowding out spending on climate action, the militarized approach also derails climate diplomacy at a time it's needed most. And finally, we need to keep in mind that the U.S. military is ultimately a tool used by our government to promote the global economic system that largely serves the wealthy both at home and abroad, at the expense of indigenous communities, working people. Ultimately, this climate crisis that we're facing is not a security problem. Our hyper-militarized approach to security is a climate problem with global repercussions. So given the urgency of this moment, we're really fortunate to be together to dive more into how to transition from a militarized economy towards a economy that prioritizes green renewable energy and worker rights. And so we have a great lineup today to talk about that. And I think that I'm going to hand this over to Phil now to provide us just a little bit more of an overview of U.S. defense spending, how it's shifted since the Cold War, and kind of what are the interests and viewpoints that are driving hyper-militarization.
Thanks. These can be depressing issues, so I'm glad we're all here to do something about it. When I sit at my computer, thanks to the Climate Institute, Commonwealth for organizing this community. I'm not a climate expert, but I'm more about depend on that it's healthy for any sane human being. I'm so glad, Montana, and never would choose graduate school. If I recall, we were doing a project that reporting using social media in terms of information on US weapons in Syria, I think,
Yeah.
which is gonna be her next book. And once we solve the crime crisis. So anyway, the question that came across in one of the shows, why is it so hard to cut the Pentagon budget? And I should point out that there have been moments when it has come down, but they've been kind of historic moments. And the Vietnam War and the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, there was a moment where it came down about 25%. The cut the uniform military by clearly some of the military production places like Southern California were hit hard. But it was instructive because the system mobilized to change them. There was a famous quote from Colin Powell where he said, essentially, I know that enemies. And all I got is Cuba and North Korea. My friend and mentor, Michael Clare, wrote a book at that time called Rogue States and Nuclear Partners, which was about how they concocted the next way. Well, what about these, countries like Iraq and North Korea that have nuclear weapons or like two major wars at once, therefore, Clinton said, well, we've cut this far and and that's when it started coming up again. And of course, since 9/11, it's been a pretty steady march toward the $1 trillion a year, which is almost impossible number to process. But as was mentioned, studied many multiples that was mentioned in the Inflation Reduction Act to deal with economy, those to depend on if you compare it to diplomacy, and one reason you're Lockheed Martin got $75 billion from the Pentagon is more than the budget of the U.S. State Department and Agency for National Development combined. The F-35, one of the greater rip-offs in the history of military procurement, they spend every year on that more than the whole budget of the Centers for Disease Control. So there's no question that there's trade-offs to be made. I mean, in the case of climate, I think it's such a large issue with so many facets. Unfortunately, we can't just move money from one side of the ledger to the other and solve the problem. But as was suggested, the connections between militarism and climate are deeper than just financial. So why is it so hard? Well, obviously there's money to do. Since 9/11, the Pentagon contractors have received $7 trillion in tax money, and about a third of that went to just 5 companies: Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. It's not like they're, even if you were an intelligent militarist, you'd be happy with how this is. Because a lot of it, well, assuming there was such a, they pay their executives $20 million a year. A lot of the money they're using to bid up their share prices. So it's basically just going to help their shareholders and the executives themselves who get paid in stock options. So at the same time, they're whining about there's not enough money. How are we going to arm Ukraine? How are we going to arm Gaza? Israel should not be happening because it's crime against humanity. They're pocketing most of the money that the companies giving them to invent new weapons. So there's that element of just the money and how to keep it flowing. The industry has 800 lobbyists, so more than one for every member of Congress. And people are constantly going from the Pentagon and Congress to lobby for these firms. Most recently, Mike Gallagher, who ran the Congressional Committee to bash China, which I think is the official name, went to work for Palantir, which is one of these new age, military companies that's going to save us all through technology after they get done studying all with China. And so this is just one little tip of the iceberg. The New York Times did a study. Scores of people have gone from the Pentagon either to the Silicon Valley military startups or to the venture capital firms that are funding them. And as one former Pentagon official said, well, if you go to work for Lockheed Martin on the board, you get a couple $100,000 a year. But if you go to a VC firm and they hit the big, you can make millions. So, a lot of these folks who run these companies are basically, gamers who decide to play with weapons. So they use these military folks for legitimacy. But of course, the military people that are vouching for them don't actually know anything about the technology they're selling. So it's an unfortunate circumstance, but that group is trying to sell itself as our saviors. They're going to build cheaper, more efficient weapons. We're going to get them from China. We're going to intimidate China. We're going to win the arms race. It's going to be cheaper than using these industrial dinosaurs like Lockheed Martin. And the problem is, these weapons are incredibly risky. We have no idea if they're going to work or cause mass slaughter by mistake. And the people who run these companies are literally insane. The head of Palantir spends a lot of his spare time trying to figure out how to live forever. Elon Musk wants to colonize space. They want to create a network of little enclaves around the world that are not governed by any actual government that can relate to each other. So like an evil federation of tech bros, there are some women in town, mostly ideologists. But I think they're also gamers. So anyway, so there's the money aspect, but sometimes that's overplayed. Because there's many industries that, melt the system, sell jobs, use lobbyists. But the other part is the US rule in the world. They wanted to be the dominant military power, endless war, which has kind of shifted from boots on the ground to drones to weapon supplies, which is kind of, until Gaza, which is so horrific that you really can't look away. It was kind of like they were trying to find a more politically sustainable form of warfare. Drones were going to be more accurate. They have special forces in dozens of countries that nobody knows about. And there was some US troops killed in Africa. Lindsey Graham said, I didn't know we had troops in Africa, let's send them out. So this is the level of leadership that we're dealing with in the Congress. So I think, so there's two elements, and Hannah, pull up the hook and do it. There's the profiteering and the corruption, which runs deep. And then there's this notion that the US, I think some people might still believe this, is a force for good in the world, and if we're not intervening everywhere, these nasty little kids in other countries are going to, misbehave. And I think there's some people are attached to that because it's hard to accept the truth of the history of the US, both how the country was formed and the role it plays in the world. And so I think, it's unfortunately, there's kind of like you have to look at this in a kind of a measured adult fashion, not, hey, I'm part of the toughest country in the world, but how can we actually live up to these various ideas that get thrown around? So it's not easy, but I think we've won these battles before. I started doing this back in the prehistoric age of Jimmy Carter, and when Reagan came in, he launched this huge nuclear weapons buildup. He wanted to put weapons in Europe that could reach Moscow in 5 minutes. He was joking around. About the bombing would start in 5 minutes, and it galvanized. A large anti-nuclear movement in Europe, around the world. The freeze campaign of the States. Basically, Reagan came from the guy who was going to start World War III to the guy who said, well, the nuclear war can never be won, it must never be fought. Almost agreed with Gorbachev to get rid of nukes until the neocons kind of pulled him back from the brink. And the nuclear arsenals in the world came down dramatically. There was progress in the right direction. And Reagan did that because of the politics. It wasn't because Nancy's, astrologist told him to do it. One of his aides, sent a memo when he was running for re-election and said, this whole disarmament thing, it's not just these peace groups. It's like, it's in the churches, it's in, elected officials. It's a problem. You need to give people some reason to think we're not going to get destroyed by nuclear weapons. So his first answer, of course, was Star Wars, which was a fraud from beginning to end. But he also became open to the idea that perhaps piloting nuclear weapons was not really the most rational thing to do for anything. So, within like an 8-year period, we were kind of in a situation similar to where we are now, to a quite improved situation. But as you know, these things don't go in a straight line. So, we're back in the thick of it, and there's work to do. I'm just glad that there's other people here, because usually when I speak on this alone, people ask me how to solve it, and that's up to the other people.
Evil term that maybe needs to be not, anti-military industrial complex, but also anti the Federation tech growth. So next we're going to turn to Miriam, who's going to talk about the U.S. military manufacturing industry and about past historical attempts at conversion from military manufacturing towards other kinds of products that would be more useful to our society. Miriam, I hope you can hear us.
I kind of can. I'm missing some of this, but I'm catching some of it. You're not on the screen. I don't know if that should be changed. Somebody mentioned there's now just a P there.
Yeah, we are working
anyway,
on it.
yeah. So I can just talk anyway. So as you know, World War II created this massive war economy, and then as the country was starting to demobilize and demilitarize, then comes the Cold War. And so the name of the War Department was changed to the Defense Department. So the idea of this permanent war economy footing was established. And of course, some of the companies that had come from the civilian sector, GM going to make tanks for World War II, some of those companies, went back to the civilian sector, but some of them said, this is a pretty good deal. And then, of course, there were other companies that were created because of this new nuclear age that we had going. So then the Cold War ended, as Bill mentioned, and by calculations I believe in, the military budget was cut by about 1/3, and the procurement budget by about 2/3. So this was a very big deal, and it created a lot of excess capacity. So too many companies competing for too few contracts. And so one of the things the Clinton administration did was to encourage and incentivize many of these companies to merge with each other. And so the result of that was there was this huge merger party, and we wound up with those 5 big prime contractors that Bill mentioned. And they have enormous power, because if you have less redundancy and fewer companies competing for contracts, you also have less competition. And so their dominance over the military market has remained remarkably stable for basically 30 years. But as Bill also mentioned, they're getting a bit of a challenge from Silicon Valley. And the head honcho of that whole effort would be one Peter Thiel, who you've probably heard of. He was a venture capitalist who hired J.D. Vance and reportedly got Trump to pick him for vice president. So his company Palantir is now supplying Israel with the software to bomb Gaza. And then he created this sort of innocuous sounding thing called the Founders Fund. And that was basically a way to seed and proliferate these Silicon Valley based military contractors. And the guy that Bill mentioned, this guy, Mike Gallagher, is actually employed by this spin-off of Palantir called Anduril. And you know, he was this defense hawk on the Armed Services Committee and this China hawk, you know, and now he's going to be using those skills to influence the shape of the budget for, you know, for particularly his Silicon Valley company. So the bread and butter of those companies is obviously software, whose leading edge is AI. And so, you know, this is the new frontier that is leading to the military giving decision-making power over, you know, where they're going to drop their bombs and when, giving that over to machines, including our nuclear arsenal. So in terms of the budget for all of this, it's kind of a tug of war between these big primes that still command, you know, the bulk of the military budget, but also these upstart startups. But it's not really a tug of war because the Pentagon likes these legacy systems that the big primes make, and then they also like the new whiz-bang, you know, high-tech stuff. And so, you know, their philosophy is we need to expand the military budget to accommodate all of this stuff. So turning to a historical attempt at conversion, the main one was during the post-Cold War period, with and what fueled it was these really significant military budget cuts. And so this spurred a whole lot of creative work by a lot of different actors to you know, take advantage of this opportunity. The organization I worked for at that time, our pitch was we need a new national mission to take the place of winning the Cold War. And it needs to be big and bold, and it needs to be big enough so that it would, you know, absorb all this, you know, energy and resources and talent that's been devoted to military technology, and you know, find something else for all of that, some place for that to go, and it needs to be big enough to build a kind of, you know, alternative economic foundation. Because if you don't build that other foundation, then the pressure to, you know, jack the military budget back up and get everybody back in business is too strong. So so we said that we'll give you the mission. It needs to be to transition our American economy to be environmentally sustainable, which is what we said back then. Nowadays, we would say it needed to be focused on climate change, and that didn't happen. 80% of the savings from these military budget cuts went into deficit reduction, so it was kind of diffused into the economy and didn't provide enough of a counterweight to you know, prevent what did happen, which was you know, this you know, jacking up of the budget, which continues to this day. So just a brief word on you know, kind of the main centers of conversion activity during that time. The first would be the government. The Clinton administration supported an array of programs to assist in this transition to a more domestically focused and civilian economy. And you know, if there's time or if folks are interested, you know, in the Q&A, we can go into what some of those were. And then, but then there was civil society, and my favorite project from that time was actually trying to replicate or at least learn from what I think Kem will be describing to you in a minute about the Lucas project in the UK. So this project in the US it took place at a Unisys factory building circuit boards for the Seawolf nuclear submarine. So the workforce was kind of annoyed by this peace encampment that was there outside their factory, and their point of view was, this is the way I put food on the table. Leave me alone. But eventually, the peace encampment folks and the union workers started talking to each other and finding some common ground, and so they started to interest a few local legislators to provide a state grant to enable the union to hire a consultant. And the union they surveyed their workforce, and they came up with about 100 different ideas of what their skills and the technology they worked on could do that would be more socially responsible than building the next Seawolf nuclear submarine. And this consultant winnowed it all down to 12 ideas. And they presented them to the company, and the company said, thank you very much. And instead of finding ways to adopt any of these ideas at that plant, instead they closed the plant down and moved one of the ideas. I mean, took it and took it to a right-to-work non-union state of Utah and developed it and created some jobs there, but not union jobs and not the jobs of the people who had originally presented it. So it's not a happy ending, but it was a very creative project, and does link up, I think, to the Lucas project that Ken will be talking about. So finally, there are the companies themselves. And my favorite success story there of sorts was originally a plant of Lockheed Martin, Bill's favorite defense contractor. Actually, in that Cold War period, when the military budget was being drastically cut, the CEO of Lockheed actually said, our growth is going to come from the civilian market, and we foresee Lockheed Martin becoming about 55% defense and about 45% civilian commercial manufacturing. That obviously didn't happen, but because now they're about 95% in the defense market. But he did say to his engineers, figure out what else we could do at this. And one plant in Binghamton, New York, a fairly depressed area of New York State, figured out how to take the hydraulic system from one of their fighter jet projects and make it into the drivetrain for a hybrid electric, at that point, city bus. And they overcame all sorts of obstacles. In this book I've done, you can read all about them. But their buses are now operating on the streets of New York City and London and Tokyo and Toronto and all over the world, basically. However, Lockheed eventually sold this facility to BAE Systems, sort of British Aerospace, which is highly defense dependent and is doing great in the new expanding market for military technology. And yet they hang on to this bus business because it's perfectly viable, but it represents only about 5% of what that facility produces. Mostly it's for the military market. So, what this shows is, it is possible to convert swords into plowshares. It can be done. They have done it. But unless the military budget can be, substantially cut, it is not going to be, it's not going to provide the counterweight that is going to, move anybody very, very far. So what's needed is, cuts to the military budget and a strong industrial policy to, to facilitate the transition.
No, thank you. That's so important. Such a key point. Especially because, these strategies and these industry interests really do make a difference in the material things we create and put out into the world. The United States produces 40% of the world's weapons and 2% of solar panels. And we can look at this versus China. China produces 80% of the world's solar panels and 5% of the world's weapons. And it's interesting that that's now being kind of used in this kind of hyper-militarized way that the government's kind of trying to pin China as being kind of a disruptive force in the world. So it's interesting how these things are wrapped up together. So we're going to turn over to Kathy here about labor.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you all. So I'm going to talk a bit about, we've heard a lot from the heart of the empire. I'm going to turn to the lapdog of the empire. We didn't mention exactly, yeah. We didn't mention it before, but Commonwealth is a UK-based organisation. So over here to link up with people doing similar work. And just before I go into the kind of labour-led process of arms conversion, I think Miriam summed up the different dynamics behind arms conversion incredibly well. I just want to give you a real whistle-stop tour of the UK's military-industrial complex. As you'll know, we have a much smaller military-industrial complex than you guys. In 2023, the US spent about $900 billion on its military. The UK spent $75 billion. But despite this difference, the UK is still the world's 6th largest military spender. As we know, the kind of also the original evil, as Bill was saying. And it's historically been a loyal outlier within NATO, keeping its military spending, comfortably above that 2% of GDP target. So why does Britain do that? And it's really so it can maintain a military for overseas intervention, normally in support of the US, and also so it can arm UK and US allies through its arms export system. I'd say most crucially, this includes its relationship with the Saudi monarchy and other GCC monarchies. Saudi Arabia has been one of Britain's most important military since the mid-1980s. Its 1985 export deal between British Aerospace, BAE Systems, and the Saudi government was still Britain's largest ever export deal. It's still going on until this day. On the topic of UK arms exports and its allies, we saw earlier this week some extremely limited action on the UK's arms exports to Israel, suspending a small percentage of its arms export licenses, but retaining the majority of its exports through the F-35 program, which Bill mentioned earlier. But despite this kind of more limited military-industrial complex, its export relationships, etc., Britain still has a military-industrial base. It's relatively significant, and I think we need to understand the political economy of that a little bit as well. In the early 1980s, this was an industrial base that had been just brought into public ownership. You had aerospace and shipbuilding were both under public ownership, but it was rapidly privatized under the Thatcher government. And actually, the height of this privatization regime came a couple of decades later under New Labour, when they sold off a bit of the Ministry of Defence itself to private equity, which is now the company Kinetic. Very profitable company. If you're looking to make an investment, they've done very well out of that process. So the kind of core dynamic of the British military industry is that privatization, consolidation around BAE Systems as the dominant contractor, and also a kind of hollowing out and the ownership of these historic manufacturing companies, often now by US multinationals. It's a political economic arrangement that's very beneficial to investors. They benefit from big government subsidies, government contracts. They pay out well to their shareholders, higher than the kind of the stock market average. It's a very wasteful, and we see both in the exports and the activities of the British military, highly destructive industry. So what's the alternative? And that's kind of where this conversion story comes in that Miriam was talking about in the US. What I really want to talk about is a specific form of conversion, which is the repurposing at either company or factory level of production towards civilian purposes. So this has often been proposed by trade unions, by workers themselves. And in the UK, the first well-known examples of this go back to the period just after World War I. At a naval shipyard in Barrow-in-Furness in the northwest of England, basically workers there conducted one of these self-audits and found several civilian products that they could transition into, but they didn't get the government support or the company support needed to deliver it. As Miriam mentioned, the kind of the most famous historic example, and one that inspired many others, was the Lucas Plan. The Lucas Plan was basically an initiative, again, within a trade union at a military aerospace company that was kind of all across the UK at the time. And it wasn't initially a plan to kind of divest from militarism or move away from military production. It came from a trade union initiative, workers looking to keep their jobs as jobs had been lost at the company over the preceding years, and also from a suggestion from Tony Benn, who was the Secretary for Industry at the time, about whether they should be nationalised or what kind of model would be best to keep jobs in the company. And the workers really wanted industrial democracy. They wanted a greater kind of governing role in what was produced. So they came up with this alternative plan for the company to keep their jobs. And through that process of investigation, they realized that the best way to do that would be to move away from the military industry. And they proposed 155 alternative products that they could make, which, despite the fact that this was in the mid-1970s, included heat pumps, included wind turbines. And I think what's really important about the Lucas Plan is that a lot of people they'll just talk about the Lucas Plan, but that was really a kind of a Lucas moment in which that example inspired work at companies all across the British military industry. It inspired work in the US. You had basically most major military industrial firms in Britain in that kind of late 70s period. You had trade unionists and workers kind of developing these alternative plans. It continued in that late Cold War moment that Miriam spoke about. We had the same shipyard at Barrow-in-Furness, trade unions looking at converting work into offshore wind. Until very recently, the last couple of years, this kind of diversification of the military industry was the policy of Britain's trade union federation, the TUC. So, as Miriam mentioned, this is something that's technologically feasible. It's also historically a demand of the workers' movement in Britain, a section of it. You also have many trade unions that don't take this position, or workers within it who want to stay, on military work. But it's certainly been something that's kind of accompanied demands for industrial democracy, for worker governance, and has come from that direction as well as from companies themselves. And I've in the last year been doing interviews with workers and trade unions to kind of explore the potential of this process. And what struck me is, despite the fact it's often seen as quite sort of fringe agenda, four of the nations have already produced parts for national women. So it's very much technologically feasible. It's just a question of investment and a question of political choices. So yeah, in the discussion, it would be good to reflect on this history for the US. And to think about how, you can build on the UAW's recent proposal to research a just transition away from the military industry, and also the work released by the IAM today, which is on a just transition in their sector as well. So yeah, there's a lot to build on both here and in the UK.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna work here.
Great.
Actually, we're gonna turn now to Adrian, who's gonna talk a little bit more about the Divest Invest framework that he's been working on with the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. I don't know if the mic is working.
Hello?
Yep.
Hi, y'all. I'm Adrian Salazar again. I'm Science, and this panel, the discussion has been great so far, and thank you again to the Climate Community Institute for hosting and Commonwealth. I want to talk a little bit about, to thread some of the things that folks have been sharing. the landscape of movements in the fight for divesting from militarization and investing in the things that we actually want, where we've been and where we're going. And to name some of the things that Hannah mentioned at the beginning, again, at this conjuncture we're at, where we're facing accelerating climate crisis. And you know, I don't have to list a litany of disasters. I think everybody knows in this room. We've just seen these immense floods again in Bangladesh and displacing people. We saw the derecho storm in Houston that put power out for days, I think like over a week for Houston, one of the largest cities in the United States. And this is happening at the same time as we're seeing the acceleration of multiple crises. We're coming out well, actually, we're still in the COVID pandemic that debilitated the economy over the last several years. And we're seeing the acceleration of wars, of militarized conflict and genocide in Palestine as we speak, where we've seen this siege going on for almost a year now, and estimates of over 180,000 people in Palestine killed, actually that being an underestimate as well. All of this is actually interwoven. The climate crisis and empire are two sides of the same coin. And I can speak about this from the experience of some of the grassroots members that are part of our network, the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. Particularly, I want to name in the Pacific, we have some members of the Micronesia Climate Change Alliance who are working to fight for climate resilience on the ground, because island states and are confronted with storms and rising sea levels. But also, it just so happens that many of these places in the global south that are former or current colonies are also the places that the military is expanding. And Guam is a colony of the United States in Micronesia. Over a third of the land on the island of Guam is military owned, US military owned and operated. And they're constructing even more sites. They've been planning to expand a Marine Corps camp and firing range. And these sites are built on sacred lands of the Chamorro people. And then when these typhoons come, it allows all of the material that is in the soil because of the toxic operations of these facilities to rise and spread out over the land and affect people's health. In Hawaii, which is also a colony of the United States that was annexed from an independent nation, we have members in Hawaii Peace and Justice who are fighting RIMPAC. If you know RIMPAC, it just happened in over the summer. It's the largest naval military exercises in the world. And 29 countries, I believe, participated in RIMPAC. And of course, all of the activities of naval ships and bomb testing that they're doing is affecting the local biodiversity, the marine ecology, as well as the people's lives. I am from the Philippines, and which is also a former US colony, that happens to have a very special relationship with the United States. And we've had military operations in the Philippines, even after so-called independence of the Philippines from the United States. And in 2014, the US and the Philippines actually came into an agreement called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that allows the United States to bring troops into the Philippines and use the military bases in the Philippines for training exercises. And since that time, the operations of the United States military are actually expanding in the Philippines. So the Philippines is a forward base for the United States military. And they engage in joint military exercises. The last 2023 had the largest joint military exercises between the Philippines and the United States. They had them again this April. And I think many of the folks in this room may be following the ways that the United States is positioning towards China through a strategy of encirclement, right? And it has bases all over the Pacific. And this is the way that our military operates as a global police force in the world. And folks mentioned $900 billion. This is our taxpayer money in the United States funding these operations that are impacting people's lives, the lands that they live on, and the ways that their communities are under-resourced. But it is also connected to the militarization here in the United States at home. When we see the accelerating militarization of our police forces of the border, there's a program that transfers military supplies to U.S. police detention program. And we're seeing the expansion of cop cities across the country. Many people may be familiar with the cop city in Atlanta. There are actually over 69 cop cities that are already operational in this country, and many more that are being built. And these cop cities are training grounds where police are being trained in military tactics, using military equipment and materials. And in some of these places, like in Atlanta, where you have the Gilly program, the Israeli Defense Forces are invited to train US military police. So I'm trying to thread for you all the ways in which the crises that we're talking about are so inseparable. The climate crisis is caused by colonialism and empire. And so our solutions to the climate crisis to actually achieve climate justice have to confront militarization. You cannot just talk about the carbon molecules in the atmosphere and thinking about dropping those numbers down is going to be enough. If you're continuing to spend $900 billion a year in a global police force that is displacing indigenous people and causing war and genocide all over the world. Wars and genocides that are producing emissions, that are accelerating the climate crisis, and that are not being counted. They're not being counted by governments as part of their commitments for reducing emissions. Okay, so that's, again, like Bill said, it's really, really depressing. But this is the world that we live in, right? And I want to position that we could possibly have a different world. And when we think about the ways that people are being affected by climate crisis, that there are solutions that we already have, our communities have, for a just recovery, for building community resilience. And there are things that folks are doing on the ground, like mutual aid, building resilience hubs, investing in local care infrastructure that can be scaled up. And if we could imagine a world in which we actually have, in case of an emergency, like another hurricane, a deployment of, sorry for the military term, a movement of resources that are care-based, right? That are non-military, non-police response to disasters, that you have care brigades that are sent out to Texas, to Florida, to wildfires in California in the West. And these are jobs that are high quality and that are training people as an alternative to going into the military out of high school because they can't figure out what else they're supposed to do with their lives. If we actually had universal jobs programs that built out the resilience infrastructure of this country, imagine what would be possible if we took even some of that $900 billion a year and invested in an economy of care. That is what a lot of the movements that are fighting for divestment and investment are fighting for now. And my organization, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, is in the middle of talking to our members and building a new divest from harm and invest in care campaign, which we hope to be sharing out very soon, that you all will be hearing about and invited to participate in. But it's about thinking about the budget, thinking about the numbers that you've heard here from this panel, and how can we actually allocate the budget in a way that aligns with our values. Martin Luther King said, a budget is a moral document. It represents the values of society. And if we were to talk about divestment alone, or if we were to talk about investment in climate solutions alone, that's not actually enough to transform our society, because you'll do one thing with the right hand and the other hand will be doing something else. And so you have to talk about both sides of the equation. The demands are interrelated. So all of this movement is happening now. And for GGJ, when we're building a divest and Invest campaign, we're actually in conversation with so many of the movements that have been advancing, trying to reduce the military budget for decades. We're taking lessons from past campaigns, like the People Over Pentagon campaign that tried to reduce the defense budget by about $100 to $200 billion. We're looking at what's happening with the BDS movement, right? And I think we are confronted by the ongoing genocide and how horrific the deaths are, the images that we see every day. But in the last 10 months, I think you can see there are places where our movements have made advances, and we have been able to make leaps in ways that were not imaginable a year ago. And so you've seen with the BDS movement, Elbit, which is an Israeli-owned defense corporation, being shut out, actually forced out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, because of the relentless organizing that people have done to shut down Elbit. I just read the news that San Francisco State University has voted to divest from 4 major weapons manufacturers. And the city of Portland, Maine also became the 3rd city in the United States after Richmond and Hayward. I think this was just like yesterday or the day before that, to approve divesting from Israel. And we have examples of the things that we want to invest in, right? We won some good things in these recent historic federal bills like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. There's some bad stuff in there too. And there are things that when we imagine the world that moves people and resources to support what people need for health, housing, for the kind of jobs and support for their family and children and good education, that amount is $360 billion or whatever. It's crumbs. It's crumbs to what we actually need to transform our economy from an economy of death to an economy of life. And we are positioning that we can move in this aperture in this moment where we've seen millions of people mobilizing in the streets, building off of the years of mobilization of young people for climate justice, of the movement for Black lives, and the uprisings that we saw over the last 5-6 years. And now people moving into the streets in solidarity with Palestine and calling for an end to the genocide, an arms embargo, and moving money, our money, out of this system of death and into the things that we actually need. So I believe that transformation is possible. We are in an aperture, in a potential moment where we could change the course of society and of this country and of the world. But it will require organizing, and it will require moving from a place of rapid response and mobilization every week to a place of strategy, of looking at the budget and actually asking these questions. What has worked? What has not worked? What do we need to do differently? And then to be able to position our vision of what is possible in the world of life and affirming care-based economy that we want. And so I think that we in this room are here, of shared mind to answer that call, but to also proselytize the call that we demand an economy that fights for, that builds housing and does not invest in genocide, that supports childcare and good quality education instead of weapons, and that can build the beautiful communities that are growing on the ground today and not bombing them. I believe that is possible, and we got to get to work to do it.
For brilliantly wrapping all of that up and showing us that another world is possible. So I'm going to pass this over to Patrick in a second. You have a Q&A. Okay, great. Glad you guys are sticking around with us.
You don't need to get much stats.
There's also a reminder, there's some food and drinks in the back in case anyone wants that. But yeah, let's just dive into some questions and answers here. Yeah.
I can make myself useful.
So Julian Assange famously said that the point of the US engaging in all these foreign wars is as a siphon for tax dollars, for public funds to be siphoned through military operations in faraway countries that are into the pockets of a very few arms manufacturers. And Chomsky more broadly had this theory from the 60s and 70s that the elites in the US got very frightened at the scale of the marches and the anti-war protests in Vietnam. And as a result, they diverted a lot of public funds away from public infrastructure and education and so on and so forth towards military industrial complex that would not have a social ROI, that would really impoverish the middle class, so they wouldn't have the time or the funds. They would be focused on their kitchen table economics and not be able to lead or participate in revolutionary or anti-establishment politics that would potentially lead to more of a socialist or a popularly democratic system. My question to you is, and take this however you want, do you think that it's the climate movement as a whole, the environmental movement as a whole is moving away from sort of this staid capitalist Bill McKibben style towards this realization that being politically revolutionary is kind of the root cause and the way to get at solving, coming to a just, fighting for climate justice? It's all connected, but are you guys outliers in the community, or is this is this a growing movement and a realization?
All right, let's go ahead and take a couple. Anybody else?
We can also shout.
Yeah, I want to make sure that they're getting this on the live stream. And for those of y'all still sticking around the live stream, sorry for everything. I'm very glad that you're still here. So maybe while y'all cook up some more questions. Oh wait, we got one here.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm Diane Froman, and as Bill knows, I go to all of the UN nuclear conferences in New York, nuclear non-proliferation ban treaty in the Middle East. And one thing that's usually missing is dealing with the underlying conflicts. I'm a political psychologist in the field of conflict transformation, which is different than conflict resolution, and affiliate and connected with Transcend International founded by Johan Galtung. So anyway, I sort of made up the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is based on 3 pillars, which is non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful uses of nuclear and reciprocal energy. And the only one they really mean is non-proliferation and energy, disarmament. So I came up with 4 pillars of nuclear elimination treaty, which is, the first one is conflict, cheaper, deeper security, dealing with underlying conflict. The second one is IRENA, which is International Renewable Energy Association. And third one is disarmament. And then the fourth one is economic conversion. And the basic principle is that if you take something away, you have to replace it with something. So it's not just about eliminating the weapons, but replacing. And this was a great panel. I learned a lot and everything came together. This is really great. Thanks.
Cheers. Let's do one more.
Hey everybody, I'm Adrian's coworker, Shah, Darga GJ. And like he said, we're really trying to like understand what's possible in this moment. And so I was really compelled to hear from Miriam in particular, like some of in the past, you know, when we've been able to win some reduction in military budget. If you can speak to, like, anyone on the panel, what are some conditions that have had to be in place at different moments, like political moments, to make that viable? Because it doesn't feel very viable right now, although we know it's desperately needed. So that's one question, like, what are the conditions that we would need to have in place to actually be able to reduce the military budget? And then the other question is around labor unions. And I think, again, like the Lucas Project and kind of, does anybody know about labor, organized labor in this moment that is like open and excited and interested in, or even willing, if not excited, to really think about some of the conversion that you were talking about, or some of the, you know, skills transfer and putting out, you know, what if we had a bunch of those proposals that were also rooted in community projects as well. So those are my two big questions.
Thank you so much. Amazing questions. So who wants to go first
I
here?
think Miriam's got her hand raised.
Oh, Miriam, so sorry. Miriam, why don't you take it away and then I'll pass it over to Phil.
There we go. Hello?
Oh, my-
Start my video. Okay. How about now?
yes.
All right. Just on that last question or point about exciting developments among labor unions, I want to go back to something that Kem mentioned really briefly, which is that the International Association of Machinists in the US, which is one of the most defense-dependent unions, has just, it was like yesterday, put out a press release. IAM takes bold steps in addressing climate crisis and embracing green technologies, releases report on clean energy economy for the future. This is really, I need to shout out the former head of the machinists in Connecticut, who's been working on this for 10 years. He got religion from reading an article by McKibben back in 2014, I think it was. And he started this lonely effort to convince the machinists that they should really take climate change seriously and that they should look at the work that could be created for machinists if climate change were really addressed seriously. And in 2016, he stood up and promoted a resolution on these grounds, and the entire leadership of the IAM was completely opposed. But he gave this speech talking about his grandchildren and the world he wanted them to be able to grow up in, and the vote among the rank and file there, put his resolution over the top. Now, it took a while. The leadership for a while just kind of shelved it and didn't really want to talk about it, but he's been at it ever since. And this was the IAM convention a couple days ago, and this guy, his name was John Harrity. I wrote about him in my book a bit, and he convinced them to join forces with this kind of climate jobs institute at Cornell University. And so Cornell, in conjunction with the machinists, have come up with this whole framework analysis of the problem and ways that and some steps that could be taken to make sure that green jobs are grown and that machinists get retrained to work on them. And several other, I haven't even had a chance to read through the whole report, but I think it's an exciting development, in conjunction with what you were mentioning, the UAW is doing. So I think there's movement, and I think also if I could just say one more thing, which is I think the jobs issue is working really well for us, because the military producers have been touting themselves as job creators as much as they tout themselves as weapons makers. Lockheed says they have a presence in 46 states or whatever the number is now. But in fact, if you look closely, the numbers in military industry have been coming down. So 3 million a decade ago, and now the main trade association for military producers only claims 1 million jobs in military industry, which seems like not enough jobs in an economy of 330 million workers, 1 million jobs shouldn't be holding hostage half of our, the budget that Congress votes on every year. Whereas, the Energy Department, now counts, 8 million jobs in clean energy. And, they put out a report, in 2023 saying that clean energy jobs grew at more than twice the rate of overall US employment. So it's a rapidly growing field, and with the question of unionization. So it's a real challenge to get these clean energy jobs unionized, but they're certainly making progress, and that is the opposite of what's happening with military industry, in which the military, the big prime contractors at least, are really trying to de-unionize by outsourcing, by subcontracting more of their work, and by moving to non-union states. And so military industry is shrinking in terms of unionization, and clean energy, with all of the the challenges that it faces, is still growing in union rates. So these are, to me, promising signs to build on.
And Miriam's book is a good read. Lots of characters, lots of stories. I'm working on a book, and every time I dip in there, I'm like, why am I doing this? Possibly match that, but I guess another book won't kill us. But in terms of preconditions for reductions, I mean, at the end of Vietnam, there have been 15 years of anti-war organizing. People had seen the devastation that our military had caused. Vets came home, turned against the war. There was a foundation there, and the military-industrial complex was freaked out by this, and they gave it a name, the Vietnam syndrome, like it was some sort of disease. What it was is people were tired of going to war. It was a positive thing. But after they won the Gulf War seemingly easily, even though it triggered decades of tragedy in the Middle East, they piggybacked on the 91 Gulf War and said, oh, the military's back. See, we can win wars. We're going to conquer the Vietnam syndrome. So you have to sort of keep these things alive. I mean, likewise, the progress on nuclear reductions in the 80s, some of the folks who helped organize that went all the way back to the ban the bomb movement of the late 50s, operating in a very vicious McCarthyite Cold War environment. So a lot of it is that the seeds are there, and we need to build on them. And there's moments, and I think we're in a moment with the encampment movement to fight back against ceasefire in Gaza. I think any U.S. official who says the United States stands for a rules-based international order is going to be laughed out of almost any room in America, except maybe somewhere in Washington. And I think, and a lot of the students are going deeper. It's about Gaza, but they're looking at how their universities contribute to militarization more broadly. You may be familiar with Dissenters, the anti-military group out of Chicago, did a webinar with Little Tips, which is about how to find all the different military connections of one's university. I met a student from University of Indiana who wanted my help with research on the university. They sent me like 16 pages of what they had done. I had nothing to add. I mean, they dug up all kinds of things I hadn't heard about. So I think, my genesis, back in the Renaissance, getting involved in this came out of the divestment movement on South Africa. And I think the encampment movement is the crisis of the moment. I believe a lot of those people are going to stick with it. They're taking much greater risk than I took in my politics as a student. They're standing up against all kinds of, financial and ideological attacks. And I'm very inspired by that, and I think it will inject energy into the larger movements for change. I think my colleagues who work on climate can speak, but I think if we don't go deeper and talk about what kind of things, the world we want to see, which cannot be based on untrammeled capitalism, then we're going to lose. And so I do think certainly a younger generation of activists are much more anti-capitalist than the people I used to hang out with. So I think there's hope there, but I think I'm not in the climate. I think other folks in the panel could speak to it more directly.
Just real briefly, so what I would have told you about is the intersections between the climate crisis and the genocide in Gaza. You can read our stuff on it. It's all very short. We've done the work quantifying the emissions from genocide, and that is not the most important reason to demand a ceasefire and arms embargo now, but it is a reason. And one of the reasons that we did that work was to try to get the sort of the climate normies of the world to understand why demanding an immediate ceasefire and arms embargo was critical in sort of like, the nomenclature that they are used to dealing with in terms of molecules or in terms of this sort of levers that they think about. And, I think we put ourselves out, the Climate Community Project, with a ceasefire statement, being one of the first climate orgs to get out there. And in return, and this is totally anecdotal, but I think between my colleagues and I, we've done something like 30 or 40 in-person and webinar events in the last couple of months, primarily for climate groups who want to hear more about the intersection of war, the war machine, and the climate crisis. So like the people on the stage, maybe we're outliers in the sense that we have the luxury of time and space to think about these issues and to sort of connect the dots. But I think that there's a growing intuitive sense. I mean, if you look at, again, purely anecdotal, but if you look at Sunrise's social media feed, it's every other post is on Gaza. We can say what we want about the big greens, but I do think that there is increasing dissension in rank and file workers, even within those orgs, that they're not taking a stand on genocide and they're not talking about the military-industrial complex more broadly. So I'd say that the anti-genocide movement is definitely going, it's strong, it continues to grow, it's going to continue to heat up as kids get back on campus. That's super exciting. Conversely, we're in a challenging spot in the climate movement right now. I think the IRA really took a lot of wind out of folks' sails, especially the way that environmental justice organizations were cut out of that law, and we can see the result of that. We get a bunch of, what Daniela DeVore calls the de-risking state, right? The leveraging state, the private giveaways or the public giveaways for private profit. That will probably do some decarb, but nothing near the scale that we need. And certainly on the other side of the ledger, the US is not paying its fair share in international climate finance to the countries that are bearing the burden of the climate crisis most directly right now, especially those countries that have been on the receiving end of US imperialism or that of its allies through 750 overseas military bases, the logistical networks that span them, so on and so forth. So this is to say, yes, maybe this conversation is a bit of an outlier, but it's definitely not the outlier it would have been if we'd been doing this 3 years ago. And I don't reckon most of y'all would have been in the room at that point. And not to say anything about your taste in politics, but I think that this is zeitgeisty right now, and it's exciting, and it's an exciting place to be, and it is not a fight that we have the option of skipping out on.
Yeah, I wanted to add to Patrick's brilliant answer here and say I have a little bit of a difference. I think one is that the difference between the genocide of a war and the genocide of decades of poverty is the scale of time. And I think you can go to environmental justice communities like in Richmond, California, or in the South Bronx, militarized communities, like I mentioned, on the front lines of the Pacific, and indigenous communities that have been resisting fossil fuel extraction, and people have been dying. Like the police have been sending attack dogs into these land and water resistors and putting people in prison. And I think for a lot of our communities who have been fighting for environmental justice for decades, these intersections are clear as day. They're a matter of life and death, right? And you don't have to convince somebody that the kind of food that they have access to in their home has something to do with the environment and the ability of their kids to breathe clean air outside. And that the reason that we can't have good things is because there's too many police on the streets and we're sending too much money into foreign wars. I think that there is an element of our movements that understands this and have been fighting, and we have been marginalized. We have been marginalized because of historic white supremacy in the environmental movement and the way that a lot of these larger organizations like to stay close to the state and like to stay close to whichever administration is in office. And so that means that talking about racial justice, talking about empire and climate crisis is inconvenient to achieving climate goals. I do think that this is an exciting time to be having this conversation. And I think that there is actually a battle for the soul of the climate movement that's happening. Because I have been able to see what's happened, and I think many people here may have with the Inflation Reduction Act, and Democrats wanting to be like, we did climate, check, we're done. And that should be good enough for everybody, right? And the planet's gonna be okay. And greater than that is the risk that those investments, those actually meager investments, are going to get captured by the existing financialization institutions that are so excited to get their hands on new public money and then actually siphon it away from the communities that are supposed to be getting it. So a lot of our folks in environmental justice organizations who aren't used to trying or who aren't used to seeing hundreds of billions of dollars come into their communities are scrambling right now, trying to figure out how to relate to all of this money. But you know who doesn't need to scramble? Large banks, large corporations, including fossil fuel corporations that have renewable energy wings. And so it's okay, right? They're doing good stuff. And so there is a real risk, there is a threat. And I think there's a technocratic element of a lot of these climate solutions that tries to focus in on emissions reductions and the technological transition and tries to ignore, like purposefully tries to ignore the social and material reality that the climate crisis is an unequal crisis and that your solutions have to address the inequality. And as we're talking about in this room, there are even parts of this discussion that are taboo in some rooms, right? We cannot even mention demilitarization because it's just like it's not feasible or it's not related. It's irrelevant to the topic of climate crisis. I think what we're trying to do is push what perspective has been at the margins into the center of the conversation. And that's what I'm hopeful for is happening. I think that you, like folks said, you can come into some of these rooms and get laughed at if you don't say climate justice is a racial justice issue. But believe me, there are people who believe that it is not, that you don't have to look to address social inequality and racial inequality to address the climate crisis. And that's what I mean by there's a battle being done right now for the future of climate solutions in this country. And because of all of this money coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, the very well-resourced organizations and corporations and banks are trying to win that battle materially. They're trying to win an economic transition that continues to benefit the same 1% that has always benefited from the economy. And what we're trying to do is say, we cannot have that same economy take over the fossil fuel economy. We need a completely different economy that is built by the people from the bottom up.
That's it. I don't know why on earth I'm following that up. It was amazing. Well, you know, I don't know of any major social change in this country that was led by a DC-based non-governmental organization. Maybe I'm missing something. And I feel very privileged that I get to do this for a living, but obviously the kind of organizing you're talking about is not going to be in the mainstream press. It's not going to, we're not going to get credit for it. Even when we win victories, they try to pretend it's not because of organizing. Without organizing, all the research in the world is practically useless. It's like an academic exercise. And so I think what you're talking about is really the basis of what we need to build on. And when the onslaught against us is greater, I think our vision has to be large. I don't think we should get into a defensive crouch. Yeah, there's crisis at the moment, but until we put out a vision of the world that inspires people to act, these larger forces are going to have a huge advantage over us. And really, people power and organizing is our strength. So I really appreciate what you have to say.
We've got about 5 more minutes.
Five more
Probably take 2 more questions. And then-
Sure.
So I wanted to ask. I just wanted to ask in relation to transforming weapons manufacturing facilities to civilian use facilities. We know that the switch from more conventional means of warfare to things like drone warfare is in part due to the fact that it takes less of a mental toll on soldiers. Like, we literally have quotes from people in the DOJ being like, just treat it like it's a video game and you're blowing up brown people. So my question is, it's kind of a two-parter. Is this also something that plays a factor in the people who are actually manufacturing things like drones? Like, we had the instance a couple months ago with Google workers picking up a fuss about having to do software for Israel's military. And I'm kind of wondering if the fact that people are increasingly not building necessarily bombs, but maybe they're coding software, if that is possibly a stopgap in some of the activism. And if it is, part 2, what do we do about that? Like, can that be fixed?
You have to like. Well, I want to make sure that folks on the chat catch it. Thank you.
My question was in relation to the follow-up of yours of like the military industrial complex forever has been like a climate bomb, and more things that are like some things that are more controversial, like the US ramping up more bases around China, or when Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of people supporting arms and weapons sales to Ukraine, and talking about like sanctions as economic warfare. It also has, climate impacts. So how do we, and maybe you're doing it through your webinars and things like that, and we're talking about Palestine, and where people are sometimes more on board here, but then still shying away from anti-imperialism elsewhere when the enemy is a little bit more confusing. Because like right now it's pretty clear it's Israel, it's clear that it's funded by the US, but when specifically like Russia, China, and how we need to collectively come together to combat the climate crisis, but seemingly are creating more barriers to that through our continuous warmongering.
Yeah, so I can talk about the first question. Part of the answer that I've done all these interviews this year with people who work in the industry, and it's definitely a dynamic in terms of like the nature of work. I mean, going back to the question of job losses in the sector, a big part of that is a shift towards these like capital intensive, R&D intensive type jobs that are, it's a move away from manufacturing. So like the stereotype that it's like these companies are providing good manufacturing jobs is becoming less and less the case. When it comes to how people feel about their work, I would say in the UK there was a variety of tendencies there. You have people who are really proud of what they do, and they see it through an ideological frame of working for the British or one of its allies militarily is something to be proud of and is protecting people. You have people who I would say are quite detached, as you described, and don't really attach what they're doing on the day-to-day to the use of their labor. And then you have people who feel like they could be doing something different, but they're kind of stuck where they are. And what I would say is that actually the nature of the work, broadly, people do have a sense of where their work is going to, like, especially in the military industry, often, even though you're making a small component maybe for a fighter jet or a helicopter or whatever it is, you do tend to know who the customer is, especially in these higher end jobs, like in the software side. They'll do, and they'll have entire jobs that are doing kind of customer service and performing a service for the eventual user. So say in some of these contexts, that would be the Israeli Air Force, for instance. So that's clear. And the kind of emotional effects of that is something that the UAW are thinking about. They basically want to look at moral injury as a health and safety concern, and to look at the rights of workers to object to working on specific projects when it would cause them a moral or psychological harm from doing so. So they're organising around it already. And it's similar in the UK. Some of the unions in the military industry, they're also kind of taking that perspective of protecting workers who want to refuse to work on certain projects. So yeah, I think there are prospects for organising that for sure.
Any questions?
Miriam, do you have your hand up on the screen? You want to give it? If not, no worries, just who's gonna.
Yes, Miriam, you have to unmute yourself.
I think I have I done that?
You got it.
Okay.
6 minutes.
Yeah, just back to the point of trying to kind of take the energy around the horrors of what's happening in Gaza, and connecting that to the US role and US militarism in what's happening. I heard I didn't know about this website, but I'll just throw it out there, called mappinggenocide.com. It's just one word, mappinggenocide.com, and it purports to have many of the US locations that are supplying US weapons used in the assault on Gaza. And so it seems to me that this is a potentially useful tool for local community activism, letters to the local paper and public forums, shining a light on, this is militarism coming home to our community, and what might we, better use our, economic base to produce. I just throw that out as a potential tool for some organizing at the local level.
Can I say 2 seconds? I think you mentioned the drone issue. I think there's this hope that they can create this kind of push button removed warfare where the consequences don't blow back. But even drone operators get PTSD because they have to watch the person die. They don't just go over and drop a bomb. They have to watch them bleed out. They do double strikes. There's been a lot of people talking about the consequences of that. And I think in the nuclear field, there's a concept called psychic numbing. That the idea of a nuclear war is so overwhelming that people try to put it out of their mind. But you can't put it out of your mind. And I think likewise, if you're having to choose between putting bread on the table, building weapons that are being used to slaughter people, that consciousness is there somewhere. And the question is there a constructive outlet for it? Which is what some of the unions are trying to do now. Say that we want our people to be able to make a living and not reinforce the war system. So I do think that the notion that they can solve this through technology and make it this kind of remote thing is a losing proposition as long as we keep yelling from the rooftops and educating folks and organizing.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, and I have so many thoughts that I want to talk about, but I know that we're at time here. And I think this conversation's really been helpful, clarifying that we need to decarbonize, but that also means we need to demilitarize, and that means we ultimately need to decolonize our foreign policy and our movements here so that we can actually build the solidarity that's required to stop militarization of our own communities domestically, but also abroad. And that the change is possible. There are people that are doing this, that are on the front lines. And it takes time, but we are here together. And I think that, building the movement to protect our future and a livable future for everyone is something that we can all do and is possible. So thank you for being here with us and hope to keep in touch and follow along and stay after for some conversation and hanging out a little bit. We have a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, great.